welcome to the Redaction Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Declan Carey, and today I'm joined by James Moules, our contributing editor, and our reporters, Quah and Richard Hansen. Richard, this is your first time on the show today. Do you want to introduce yourself to some of our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. I originally from New Zealand, lived in Australia, and now I live here in the UK. Freelance journalist, just starting out actually. I changed careers. I was a professional opera singer actually for 10 years before I did this. Studied politics at uni, really enjoy it. Writing various things, particularly about the US electoral race, and hoped I've got some interesting things to say.
Good stuff. Yeah, we're definitely going to be talking about that today. And Mason, as you can probably see, has come fully outfitted for today. Mason, can you just say a little bit about what the main topic's going to be later?
I mean, the main topic of today's episode is going to be how we trust experts, how we know which experts are trustworthy. Can we trust somebody just because they're wearing a lab coat or because they claim to be a government spokesperson? What is it that makes somebody qualified to make a decision?
Yeah, so lots to think about and lots to chew on later on. I mean, first of all, let's look at the US election. I just want to start with a quick tweet by Joe Biden, which I found because we were talking about a few weeks ago whether Joe Biden's going to get personal with Trump. And I don't know if you saw this tweet that he put out. This was a couple of days ago. He put, more than 1,000 people died from COVID yesterday. Donald Trump watched 8 hours of TV. If I'm president, you might not always agree with me, but I promise you I will always show up and fight for you. So it seems he's getting a little bit more personal now with Trump. What do we make of that?
I think he is trying to speak to moderate Republicans in a tweet like that. I think he's realized that he's probably not going to win the election from the left, despite what the Bernie Sanders crew might want to have people believe. So with something like that, I think he's trying to bring in as many sort of mainstream moderate Republicans into his tent.
Yeah, like just as a numbers game, there aren't enough people on the left to prop up the Democratic Party. People from the center and from the right need to be brought in. And the easiest way to do that without actually conceding anything policy-wise is to just post memes about Trump bad.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, with the Electoral College, if he pivots to the left, for every vote he's going to gain in California, he's going to lose 2 in Ohio, and he's going to lose 2 in Wisconsin, etc. So I think he's kept the left. He's kept the left there. I think he's probably going to largely ignore them now, and he's going to try and bring on as many swing voters as he possibly can. I saw a statistic. I think he's winning independents sort of 63 to 37 or something at the moment, and it's tweets like that I think that are going to bring more and more of them on side.
Of course, it was only a few thousand votes in the Rust Belt, something like just a matter of a few 10,000 votes in the Rust Belt last time that swung the election in favor of Trump. Joe Biden only has to win back fewer than 100,000 votes across 3 states in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, not lose any further states to Trump from the Democrats, and the election is in the bag. Yeah,
although he's opened up, there are a few other factors at play I've seen. I mean, at the moment, there was a poll that came out this week, a big poll in Florida, which had quite a large voter sample, and it looked at likely voters rather than registered voters, which tends to be the case after Labor Day. And he was only winning something like 50% of the Latino vote, which is not massive. I mean, I think Hillary Clinton carried something like 80% of the Latino vote in Florida, despite losing the state. So I think there might be something to be said for the fact that he's perhaps losing some votes there, but he's gaining votes in places like Arizona and even Texas. And in parts of the Rust Belt, I mean, his numbers in Ohio are worse than they were 4 years. So Biden's numbers in Ohio are worse than they were 4 years ago, or than Hillary's were 4 years ago. So there's every chance that the electoral map may look slightly different this time.
Do you think it's likely then that we could see this being a long-term trend, and that sort of down the line we could see states like Texas, Arizona, Georgia being swing states that are usually voting Republican at the moment, while at the same time the Rust Belt is competitive, and a lot of them might even go more solid Republican, states like Ohio?
Yeah, it's very hard to say, though, I think, because of the cult of Trump. Because you've got a lot of voters who aren't necessarily ideologically left or ideologically right at the moment. They just like Trump, or they hate Trump, one or the other. So I think if the polls stay true and he doesn't get reelected and he goes off into the wilderness, or goes somewhere with his Twitter feed, there might be a bit more of a realignment, but I think it's a little bit too early to say. And I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Declan. It's at the moment, if Biden makes this election about Trump's personality, Biden wins. If he makes it more about issues, if he talks more about healthcare and ways that he wants to reform that, or he talks about other, defunding police or not defunding police, etc., then I think Trump has more of a path to win.
Well, of course, one big issue at the moment is in California, the wildfires which have been raging. That's been quite a big thing. That the governor of California attributed that to climate change, and I think it's very obviously the case. That's obviously going to be a heavy part of that. What's the reaction been from Trump and Biden and some of the electorate in America to these fires? Is it going to be big on the agenda for this election?
I think it's tough because they're in California. I think, those 55 electoral votes are sewn up for Biden now, no matter what. So I think the Trump campaign are probably going to do their best to ignore it as best they can. And the Biden campaign are probably smart enough to realize that it's not going to win them any votes from the other side of the country where they need. As sad do with climate change.
I would contribute that outside of electoral politics directly, if the Australian wildfires from last year are anything to go by, it is a matter of hours or minutes until the wildfires are attributed to radical Antifa arsonists with no probable cause. It's a narrative that was pushed very hardly in the past, and Trump's only been hyping up that kind of threat.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's definitely it's definitely easy to blame it on arsonists and say these things were deliberately lit. The rhetoric in Australia has been, when there've been wildfires, that they're deliberately lit actually by firefighters themselves, believe it or not. So that adds a whole other layer of problems when you're trying to get to the bottom of why they occurred.
Yeah, another group that was blamed in Australia was the Green Party, despite never, holding any official power. They were attributed with climate legislation that somehow increased the number of wildfires.
Yeah, and despite often voting in the Senate with the Liberal Party, we were the Conservative Party in Australia, to block, to pass mining legislation at the expense of Labor. So it's interesting that that's been said.
Yeah, one thing we spoke about a few weeks ago was that maybe in order to succeed, Joe Biden needs to go home, switch on the TV and hide as much as possible from being on it. Just let Trump, take the view and just get crucified on TV.
Yeah.
Do we still think that's the case? Because Biden seems to be doing quite well.
If your opponent's hair is on fire, get out of the way.
Yeah.
And at the same time, in 2016, that was kind of what helped Trump so much, is that he just said these outlandish, outrageous things and gave himself all the airtime. And people were like, who's Jeb Bush?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is somewhat double-edged, because there will be a contingent of voters that go on polling day and they'll just vote for whichever name they heard most recently.
And it's been interesting to see Kamala Harris has been prevalent in the press. I've seen a lot of interviews. I've seen her on social media a lot. Her face is out there a lot more than Tim Kaine was. Tim Kaine? Apologies to the Virginian. As Tim Kaine was in 2016.
I think you might have just said it all there, mate.
I think so. Who was Hillary's VP pick? Indeed, and we definitely know who Biden's VP pick is.
Well, that's just the thing. Kamala Harris is probably the most high-profile VP pick of either party since Sarah Palin.
Agreed.
And that's clearly because Joe Biden's age is in question, and there's very much the possibility that she'll be possibly de facto president, if not de jure president, pretty quickly.
If Biden's elected, I would be incredibly surprised if he seeks re-election in 2024.
Same. Yeah.
Do we know how old is he now, Biden?
He's born in 1942, so that makes him 78, unless he's yet to have a birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the issues that James, that I think you mentioned when we were talking about this podcast, was who might be in Biden's cabinet. What type of figures are we going to see? Are we expecting anything radical with that if Biden does win the election, or are we going to see it as quite a safe, maybe moderate choice?
I think he'll throw a bone to the progressives, but yes, I think it will be a more moderate cabinet, most likely. I reckon he might give something to Elizabeth Warren, like I say, to throw a bone to the progressives. I don't see him giving anything to Bernie Sanders, but I think we'll be seeing figures like Amy Klobuchar in there, and those sorts of figures, the more moderates who are running and have gained a bit of a profile by running. People like Kirsten Gillibrand as well, maybe Andrew Cuomo.
I think you've seen enough of an endorsement from Bernie Sanders to suggest that something has been promised to his side of the progressive side of the Democratic Party. But I think it may also depend on what the state of Congress looks like as well. You know, if the Democrats manage to get the majority in the Senate, there obviously is going to be a greater chance of legislation getting through. So it might change the makeup of the cabinet as well.
I do wonder what role sort of Bernie Sanders might have. You know, if there's not something in cabinet, where do figures like Bernie go? The left leaning, does it disappear? Does it reemerge? What do we think about that?
I think it's possible that it would reemerge. With Trump out of the way, there is a lot more space to have these ideological arguments. I think a number of things are being parked just while Trump is here, and everybody is doing their best to focus on getting sort of lancing the boil, if you will. So I think they will rear their head. You know, the Democratic Party is probably going to have to look at itself and what it stands for into the future if it wants to remain electorally popular.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think AOC is going to become more the most prominent figure on the American left now. Bernie Sanders is going to have had his moment. We're going to be seeing it more in figures like AOC, Nina Turner, and the likes.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie's not getting any younger. And I think if he feels that he can pass the torch to these younger progressives, then I think maybe he'll bow out of politics, because he's is he 80 now, or he's pretty close? I think
he just turned 79.
Right. Okay. Well, so he's
he's
getting a little bit long in the tooth.
Mm.
Yeah, and you had a very interesting piece that went out on Redaction this week, Richard, about the potential nightmare situation, and that's all to do with mail votes, which I believe are already started, right, for November?
Yeah, absentee balloting. I think has begun in North Carolina already, so the Republicans have come out. Well, I think it's today or yesterday, actually. The White House press secretary has said that they really want to draw a line in the sand and see a winner declared on election night itself. And that's because of the split between mail-in voting and turning up at the polls. It's very likely that Trump will be leading in a number of states which he has no business leading in on election night. Whereas once those mail-in ballots are counted, that'll flip to Joe Biden. So I think there's a very dangerous situation where there's going to be about a week where these votes are continuing to be counted, and Trump will be losing electoral votes left, right, and center, and he'll be doing everything he can to delegitimize these mail-in ballots, calling for fraud and fake news and rigged elections and all of those lovely phrases which he loves to put on Twitter. So yeah, there's a phrase called the Red Mirage. So there's a think tank paid for by Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire ex-Democratic candidate who's very much behind Biden now, who says that as of midnight on election night, Trump could have 400 electoral votes in terms of where he's ahead, whereas that could almost be flipped entirely on its head a week or two later.
Very interesting. So there's lots of things to come, and I think I would be surprised if I saw Trump go without a fight. I can't imagine anything like that's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think he's going to do everything he can to slow down the process of counting these votes. The closer and closer that we get to when the Electoral College actually meets, which I think is December the 14th, then the more difficult it's going to be to keep this counting going. I mean, even more so January the 6th, which is when the Congress certified the new president and vice president. And interestingly, that'll be the new Congress. It won't be the old Congress. So it could be a completely Democratic one. And I mean, even if we get towards January the 20th, I mean, if we don't have a declared winner by then, Nancy Pelosi becomes the acting president while we sort this mess out. And so, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen if that's the case.
I mean, she becomes president, though, doesn't she? She doesn't just become acting president.
Well, the phrase is acting president, but yeah, she will have all the powers. She'll be the commander in chief. She'll have the ability to veto legislation if she wants to, despite being the head of another branch of government. So constitutionally, that raises questions. And yeah, I was talking to a political friend of mine based in Minnesota yesterday, and he says, you could see Trump holed up in the White House, refusing to leave, and sort of squatting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, this is definitely kind of worst case scenario territory. I'd in some ways prefer to see a comfortable Trump win than this, because the probability that there'll be so many protests, violence on both sides, on the right, primarily, is high. And, you don't really want to see that anyway, really.
You're just imagining that image of troops leading Trump out of the Oval Office, and
yeah, I know. All of us, as soon as Biden takes the oath, Pelosi takes the oath of office, I know we were very much in uncharted territory. But thankfully, there is this period of time, this transition period that does exist. It's not like it needs to be settled absolutely immediately. But I think you're going to see more and more of this from the Trump campaign. Of election night is the results that we're going to look at and we're going to stand by. It's interesting. There are a number of states, especially battleground states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where mail-in ballots by law may not begin to be counted until after election day itself. So you've got a number of people who are working behind the scenes to try and get these laws changed, so that some of this absentee stuff can be counted as it comes in.
It'll be interesting to see if the Supreme Court gets wheeled into this at all, because of course Trump has maybe not been able to quite as radically reshape it in his own image as he'd have liked. He's had 2 picks, but Neil Gorsuch recently voted against him, didn't he, on the transgender legislation? So it might not be the most amenable Supreme Court to him. At the same time, it's still 5-4 conservative liberal. So,
indeed. And I think it probably depends what shape that happens. If the Supreme Court elect to hear something, I mean, I know we saw in Bush versus Gore in 2000 that obviously the Supreme Court got involved, and it was interesting that when they handed down their decision to halt the Florida recount, they specifically said that this case will not form any precedent into the future. So it's very difficult to know which direction the Supreme Court would go and what they'd perhaps decide on. Would it be to halt a recount? Would it be to accept specific amounts of absentee balloting? I don't know. Is the ultimate thing.
One thing I'm really interested in, I mean, we've seen that most polls actually putting Biden in the lead at the moment. There's plenty of discussions going on about if Trump loses, will he try and cling on to power in the White House somehow? Do we think Trump is maybe positioning himself as fighting a losing battle? Do you think he's maybe getting a little bit afraid of how it's going so far? And I'm going to bring Mason in here for this one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that at this point, it's pretty clear that the instant Trump is out of the White House, whether legally or not, he's going to be arrested. I don't think that's up in the air at this point. There are so many things that he is currently only free from responsibility for because he holds the highest office in the United States. And the instant that protection evaporates, he is going down. And I think that means that, he is going to go down kicking and screaming, and is going to do as much as he can to contest everything that goes against him. We've seen how every public service announcement about COVID has been turned into part of his election apparatus. He'll be giving an unlighted press conference about vaccine development, and he'll talk about how liberals want to create mandatory abortion or something like that. So, yeah, it's a nightmare.
I think in every election before this, we've seen losers consent. Hillary Clinton conceded to Donald Trump when it was, and we just said that it was only a matter of 80,000 votes across 3 states. I mean, she could have, I suppose, said, it was rigged, I want to have recounts in those 3 states, et cetera, but she said, no, we saw it with Romney, we saw it with McCain, we saw it with Carey, we saw it with Gore, even when he got arguably shafted by the Supreme Court. We're not going to see that this time. It's going to be a very volatile situation leading up to January the 20th.
Yeah, and one thought is, what happened to a depowered Trump? Does that figure go away, or does that figure continue to use the influence of a former president to try and get his own way? I think that's a really quite interesting question.
Well, in terms of domestic unrest within the United States, you might say Trump has the potential to be just as dangerous out of office as he is in.
Yeah. He's still going to have his Twitter.
He's still going to have his Twitter. He might have a bigger media platform. He'll be appearing regularly on Fox and Friends. He might even have his own show, and he's just going to be whipping up hatred on a daily basis.
I don't think we'd see as much international influence from him as other ex-presidents. there are going to be a lot of countries where he's no longer as welcome. It's not going to be like, say, for example, Jimmy Carter, where we have former President Trump helping Africa cure ringworm, or not ringworm, whichever one it is that, disgusting.
Absolutely.
Imagery. Very good work for Jimmy Carter.
I think it's probably going to depend on what the Republican Party decides to do. If Trump loses and they lose both houses of Congress, say, just as an example, not beyond the realms of possibility, they might think to themselves, okay, we tried the Trump experiment. This isn't working. The RNC are going to step in and try and get another sort of figurehead, whether that's Mitch McConnell, perhaps, whether that's the minority leader in the House of Reps. There are a number of other figures, and also some figures who have sort of gone away into the shadows. I mean, Mitt Romney is still a senator, for example. I mean, he could come out and try and say, right, I'm going to take the torch of the sort of right wing, the Republican Party, and then Trump won't have a political entity to cling to anymore. But you're right, he'll still have his Twitter feed, and he'll still go on television a heck of a lot.
Yeah, it could be extremely interesting to see what happens with that.
It'll be interesting to see if he runs again in 2024 as well, if he loses now.
Yeah,
which I would guess he will. I reckon either he will run, or Trump Jr. or Ivanka will run, or something like that. There will be a Trump running for president in 2024.
I completely agree. I was talking about this morning. Yeah, I think it'll probably be his son. I mean, Trump will be nearly 80, and I think is he born in 1946? So that'll be, he'd be 78 in 2024. I mean, I think it would be passing the torch. But you're right, similar ideas, similar worldview, similar unfiltered nature. Donald Trump Jr. 2024.
But I guess, would we expect like a Trump dynasty to have party backing if he loses here?
Well, that's the thing. I suppose they would have to. He'd obviously have to go through the same primary process that he went through in 2016. He managed to slay all before him in the primary. Then, Jeb Bush, who and all of them. So there's every chance that the similar thing could happen. But then again, we will have the benefit of hindsight by then. So perhaps Republican voters will be less likely to get behind him.
Okay, well, there's lots to be seen. What's going to happen there? Let's move forward slightly to what is our main topic of today. As Mason described earlier, we're looking at the topic of experts today, and we're going to be reviewing a video by PhilosophyTube, which is, I believe, one of this podcast's favorite YouTubers, and looking at what we think of that. So, I mean, first of all, we've got to go to the famous quote from Michael Gove, 2016, before the EU referendum. People of this country have had enough of experts. Was he right?
I mean, I think the important bit that a lot of people miss when analyzing that quote is that, they're missing the last two words. People in this country have had enough of experts from Brussels. And I think that does make a lot of difference. I think I could fairly... I could do a fair job of... Pardon?
Sorry, did he say from Brussels in that quote?
I do believe so, or from Europe, or some equivalent statement. He was interrupted before finishing the sentence.
Okay.
So if I were to try and steelman the position, I think it's that the interests of EU certified experts runs counter to British interests, either intentionally or by coincidence of them having their own goals to achieve. They are not making decisions that benefit the United Kingdom. And if I were to try and extend this into more populist rhetoric and get myself elected, I would extend this to experts within the UK. The academics of the large cities have a very different set of interests to the working class Briton in a 9-to-5 job. They benefit from a system that has impoverished the majority of the population. And once you've accepted those two premises, that experts from outside of the country and experts inside of the country can't be trusted, then suddenly the only person who can be trusted is the person who's making this argument. Anyone who disagrees with you can be labeled the wrong kind of expert, and it's basically the same rhetoric as fake newsing everyone who disagrees with you.
And I suppose you're appealing to people's hearts rather than their heads necessarily as well.
Yes.
Yes, it is an emotional argument, isn't it? To say economists, researchers, scientists are out to get us. You know, that is a thing that comes from the heart. Isn't that a really difficult thing to challenge, though? I mean, how can you say someone's wrong if it's not backed up by facts or anything like that? It's just backed up by emotions and how they feel. It's really hard to tackle that, isn't it?
Well, I think we've touched on that earlier when talking about Trump. Is to meme him and attack his character rather than to attack him on policy. Got to play the people who are making these points at their own game.
Yeah, and that was something that we did see happen to Gove at the time. He was laughed out of that interview.
And yet it's probably one of the sticking phrases to that Brexit campaign. Aside from take back control on the side of the bus, that's probably one of the other main ones that we can remember 4.5 years later. But James, I think you make a really good point where playing them at their own game is probably actually the only way that you're going to be able to get through to large amounts of the electorate, to try and expose the failing of the person, rather than to bring in facts and figures and then your average common man, I suppose, the one with the 9-to-5 job, etc., might just be switching off to.
I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind this in the context of sort of in the 90s when we saw massive drops in political turnout, massive drops in political engagement, where we were just seeing this era where the politicians are the experts. Like, we're in a post-political, post-ideological world, in which we did just see politicians as these sort of very bland middle managers who are just there, sort of managers appointed to do a job rather than leaders appointed to present a vision. Yeah. And when people like Trump came along, that challenged that, and a lot of people just didn't really know how to respond to it.
Yes, I mean, I think there was a large swathe of the electorate that wasn't engaged at all on this side of the Atlantic and on the other ones. So if you look at Brexit and you look at Trump, both of them engaged a large percentage of the electorate who hadn't voted in a long time. And I think it's probably because these sort of conservative, the right of centre leaning entities thought, well, we're not going to win anybody on the left. You know, we're less likely to win in the centre, so we're going to have to lurch further to the right and find these people.
Just to pick you up a bit on that, that's a very interesting point. But is it the fact that they were targeting people who hadn't necessarily voted before, or was it a voice that united those voters? Because I'm just thinking in the UK, for example, a lot of the perhaps far right voices were pretty fragmented and divided going up until that point. That perhaps offered a united front for them all to pull together and vote for one place. I don't know. How do we see that point?
I think it comes back to a sense of if you're part of a team. You know, if you've been a victim of austerity, you know, you've had, you know, things are not as good as they were 10 years ago. You know, you are finding it hard to get an appointment at your doctor's surgery. You are finding it hard to have your kid get into the school you want to. And you read the Daily Mail and you're reading the Sun and you're reading all of these, you know, right-wing newspapers. It is easy to just blame it on one thing. And it's, you know, if you have the football analogy, I mean, you can have the most terrible team in the entire league, but if you're sitting with all of your fans together, doesn't matter how that team goes, you're going to win together and you're going to lose together. So it does give a sense of community and camaraderie,
an identity,
indeed.
Yeah. What kind of identity do we see in the person who might oppose an expert? Who is that type of person who hears Michael Gove saying, we've had enough of experts, you know, and you're watching that on the telly and you say, yes, absolutely. Who is that person?
Well, I suppose it's somebody who has perhaps already made their mind up. You know, they want something to happen. They've been convinced of its reasons already. So it doesn't matter what comes back. It harks back to the Trump quote where he says he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he won't lose any votes. These people are going to stick with him through thick and thin, because if they desert him, where do they go? They don't necessarily go straight into the arms of the opposition, because the opposition have been rubbished by all of the talking heads that they listen to on a daily basis. So it leaves them out in the wilderness. And, you know, I guess in some ways you're better off in the tent than you are outside.
It's worth bearing in mind, of course, in the context of Brexit with that quote, that you had a lot of experts forecasting economic doom and gloom if Britain was to leave the European Union. But to a lot of people who had already made up their minds about voting Brexit, they already felt that their lot couldn't get much worse anyway. It's like, this isn't the Britain I recognise when you say things are going well in the EU. And it was just a sense of a politics that's completely detached from people's actual day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. And you're seeing similar aspects with the response to COVID now, I think. When you've got, I personally, I live in Cheshire, but I'm currently in London, and just looking at how people in London are, masking up and social distancing, is a lot. They seem to be a lot better at it than people up north, and I wonder if part of that is to do with, things aren't great. So if things get any worse, it's not going to matter too much to me.
Yeah, I have a bit of a theory on this too. I was discussing this only yesterday with a friend, and obviously I'm from Manchester. I'm also living in London at the moment, and I've noticed exactly the same thing as you, Richard, that, in Manchester, not many people I've seen wearing masks out on the streets, but here it is a lot more. I mean, I wonder if that's the case, that when people in Manchester, for example, which is a very Labour voting city, when they see Boris Johnson, people like Matt Hancock on the TV, consistently changing the message, consistently giving mixed ideas out there, this is not someone that they probably voted for. It's not someone they trust in most likelihood. They're not going to listen to that. So I think when you look at that, in that case, the government, I suppose, in this sense, is the expert who is telling us what to do. But of course, they're going to not listen to that. Of course, they're going to rebel against that. So
and they have other concerns. Is my child's school open? What am I going to do for childcare now? How am I going to work from home successfully? It's interesting. I work part-time in a supermarket, a rather large chain supermarket. And it's incredible how many people come in without masks on. And occasionally, if I question them about it, I mean, it's not our job to try and enforce this. I'm not paid enough to get into that many arguments all day. But when I talk to people about it, they just think, I'm sick of it now, and I've just got to continue on doing what I need to do. So it's the reasons like this. It doesn't enter their mind as to be a priority.
I do want to sort of pull back to that statement that Declan was making, where the government is the expert and they are saying what to do, because I think that does in a way strike to the core of it. An expert isn't a person with a certain number of academic qualifications. It isn't somebody who knows the facts. An expert is somebody that you trust to make decisions. That's one of the main academic definitions of expertise. And so that does mean that there is a level of sort of rhetoric and performance that goes into being an expert. We wouldn't listen to Boris Johnson telling us to wear masks if he was doing it streaming on his phone from underneath a bridge with a subway running overhead and he was wearing a tinfoil hat. But we do assign more trust if he's doing it in an official briefing room, flanked on either shoulder by scientific experts who he passes all the questions on to. That's a scenario where we're more liable to assign trust, and that's something that can very easily be sort of gamed.
Do you think there's
sorry?
No. Do you think there's something to be said about that? Right now, you're right. Boris Johnson is trying to be the expert. Being flanked by other experts. But do you think there's something to be said about the fact that these were the people 4.5 years ago who were saying those specific people that we've had enough of experts from Brussels, albeit, but the quote is largely publicized as people have had enough of experts. Now these same people are trying to be the experts themselves. And it's no wonder some people aren't trusting them, especially in perhaps more Brexit voting areas of the UK.
Yeah, like anti-intellectualism is like it's something that spreads very effectively. I mean, the main example is that a large amount of like current distrust towards the scientific establishment that we see today, it comes from the climate debate. It comes from people being told for in some cases decades that the scientists have been saying for years that everything was going to go wrong, but you don't feel a difference in temperature, do you? So maybe the scientists are wrong on this. And if they're wrong on this, what else are they wrong about? And so once you've sort of peeled back that first layer of defense, it becomes very easy for the entire thing to split open, for people to just say, I'm not willing to trust any of these people.
Yes, and I think the tone of it is also key, because there is this image of the scientist, the researcher, who sits in the kind of liberal metropolitan elite kind of figure, in the city in London, very sort of educated maybe. But there's a little bit of opposition to that view now. It kind of, in a way, reminds me a little bit about some of the criticisms that Jeremy Corbyn got, born in London, raised there, doesn't represent, working people. Is that something that comes into it?
I think it does. And I think that, that can very often be a valid critique of what we see as experts. Because in order to become an expert, there are certain checkboxes that you need to tick before you can even get in the door. You need to be wealthy enough to get a good education. You need to have a good way of speaking that will make you popular with the media. You need to look right. You need to present yourself well. And these are all things that we saw Jeremy Corbyn get criticised for. He didn't wear the right kind of suits. His glasses were slightly wonky. He didn't look like a stereotypical expert, but all of the slanderous parts of being an expert still applied. He was still a Londoner. He was still detached from working class interests. And so it is something that very much cuts both ways.
And yet on the other side, we have somebody who perhaps needs a haircut. Boris Johnson doesn't perhaps present himself in a way that he should either. And what was that famous quote that David Cameron gave to Jeremy Corbyn in Prime Minister's Questions once? Was, do up your tie, tuck in your shirt, or maybe not tuck in your shirt, do it your tie and learn a national anthem.
Do up your tie, wear a proper shirt, and wear a proper suit and sing the national anthem.
That's it, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are people that are guilty of that on both sides, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, the idea of sort of this sort of level of expertise that shows to be phony, breaking down people's trust in the experts altogether, I think brings us neatly onto the Philosophy Tube video, in which he talks a lot about the AIDS crisis. I mean, Mason, what did you make of the video to that end?
I mean, a lot of it was science and history that I'd studied myself, so I had a great interest in it. And there were so many things that I would have wanted to add to that script if I was allowed to proofread it. There's so many things. I mean, I guess like I've made the statement a couple of times so far. Expertise is performative, and that it does sort of tie into the history of the AIDS crisis, as was discussed, because the patients were not listened to in their own clinical trials. What self-respecting man in a lab coat would be willing to listen to an uneducated person from the gay or trans community, who might not even be white, might have a mohawk, might wear too much leather? How can you trust somebody like that to understand biology, despite the fact that none of those things have anything to do with biology? And so it was, there was actually a very specific historical figure who sort of was instrumental in changing this, called Iris Long, if I wrote down her name correctly. And she was a retired chemist who signed up with the AIDS activists and taught them how to talk like a scientist, taught them how to read scientific journals, and eventually worked with them so that they could publish their own. And it was only at that point that the scientific establishment was willing to listen to them. There were so many times that the patients and the people suffering from diseases knew more than the people researching them. Protesters had been saying for years, for example, that the very overused drug AZT was ineffective at treating AIDS and was worsening their symptoms and side effects. And it took years of these protests before the men in lab coats said, we've actually run the numbers and discovered that it doesn't work. AZT doesn't work.
Made famous by the film Dallas Buyers Club from memory.
Yes,
indeed.
One of the points in the Philosophy video, which is quite potent, is the comparison between when HIV was in America in the 80s and coronavirus today. I believe in the script he says, a population which didn't believe in the disease, a president who didn't believe in it, and they just let it carry on. And look what happened. Do we see parallels with today?
I could talk for hours about all of the disgusting things that Reagan did to the gay community. He suppressed research, actively worked to defund it, and it was all intentional. It was all done for something that he called the moral majority. The idea that anybody who actually came down with the disease was deserved it. Maybe because they hadn't properly socially distanced in the bedroom. And I think that that's an important point because it mirrors the rhetoric that we see today. The spike in current cases isn't because schools have been reopened and everyone's been sent back into work at the offices. It's because people are hanging about in pubs in groups larger than 5 people. That's the obvious cause. Everything is sort of attributed to personal responsibility.
But it's interesting that in this case, the accusations aren't being leveled at one section of the community. Like in the AIDS crisis, it was the gay and trans community that were at the beginning made to feel responsible for it. Whereas in the COVID crisis, it's everyone. But I do wonder if that will move, and we'll say, right, there will be
we have seen specific groups get sort of hit harder with accusations of spreading COVID. Asian people early on. In Korea, there was a stigma towards LGBT people who were thought to be spreading COVID more rapidly than other communities. And so this does actually, in a way, sort of mirror the rhetoric of the AIDS crisis, because, it wasn't exclusively gay people. It was gay people, trans people, a large number of Black people caught it. But, we don't remember them as well because there were fewer Black people in the clinical trials and being given television slots. And so there does sort of need to be an intersectional lens applied to this, in that a disease is going to hit the people who are worst off the hardest and then sort of work its way up from there.
We only get some high-profile cases like when Eazy-E died of AIDS, for example.
Yeah. I'm going to mention something which I saw on Twitter the other day, and I apologize because it's something I saw from Spiked, which I don't like raising very often. But there was
Here we go.
there was a tweet from a Spiked commentator who was mocking Kay Burley for taking on Tony Abbott for remarks which were perhaps homophobic, misogynistic. And the tone of it was basically that Kay Burley was obsessed with an issue which wasn't really important. And I think that's such the wrong way to go about it, because as we spoke about, when HIV was spreading in America in the 80s, one of the big things, as Mason said, was that it hit communities who were part of minorities and who were not listened to. And that made the problem much worse. Philosophy Tube mentions in South Africa, where the government basically ignored what was going on at first, and it hit so many communities, and it's still going on today. It's still a problem today. And I think what we see with coronavirus is very similar. I think we see communities in the UK, people from BAME communities, people from, poorer communities are being hit harder by it. You think about people who live in the suburbs who work in an office and can work from home. How much contact are they going to have with other people? Probably very little if they want. But you think about someone who lives in an inner city social housing situation, very dense. They might work in a restaurant where they're coming into contact with people every single day of the week. They're much more likely to suffer from and contract coronavirus. So to me, it's clearly linked, and it makes these issues even more pressing. It magnifies the issues in society that we've got at the moment.
Yeah. And one point that the Philosophy Tube video didn't cover in the in sort of HIV research that I think is the most important takeaway is that sometimes you do want to go outside of the experts. So one of the most pivotal things in HIV research was when all of the people with HIV on the clinical trials started sharing around their drugs so that everyone got partial doses, the results were better than control groups that took their exactly prescribed medication. And this is because the best way of treating HIV is to not use a single drug, but to use several drugs in combination. And this combination therapy was basically pioneered by the patients who were forced into it by having to share their medications. And this is that technique is still used today. All modern HIV medications are based around the combination therapies that would have never been discovered if patients didn't break scientific regulation.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I want to come back to, we spoke about the government as experts, about Boris Johnson presenting himself as an expert. Does it affect anything, the fact that Johnson had and survived COVID and went through intensive care? Does that give him any authority on this issue in some people's eyes?
I think yes, almost certainly. Having personal experience relating to something makes people more likely to listen to you on it. I mean, how many arguments have you heard that start with, as a mother, as a father, as a person who has had COVID, as a person who has faced this kind of persecution in the past? It's important rhetoric because people's life experiences do influence how they are able to interact with these things. But Boris Johnson's experience is very different from most. He had a ventilator set aside for his personal use, while other people were queuing around the block just to get hospital slots.
And he never even used it in the end.
Yeah.
Whose life could that have saved?
Probably several people.
But it is interesting that he's not used that publicly very much. You know, the newspapers haven't written about it all that much, not recently anyway. You know, trust Boris, he had the disease. You're correct that it's definitely something that was mentioned in the immediate aftermath of his recovery and while he had it as well. But it's less so now.
Boris.
Yes, indeed. But I wonder if that will come up again, maybe as another particular political crisis comes and they need some way to get out of it.
And of course, we've seen everyone's favourite edgy maverick, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who keeps on testing positive for coronavirus. But I don't know how many people are taking his hot takes seriously.
No, indeed.
That's a bit messy. Yes, I mean, going back to Michael Gove, if I may, thinking about, you know, attacking experts in a time of an EU referendum. I mean, I was thinking about this, and it does seem that perhaps it might link to something a little bit deeper. And I'm curious to what you guys think about that. That we're looking at sort of perhaps even conspiracy theory territory of anti-government trust, of, you know, globally linked organizations trying to take down the establishment. Is there any way that we can see this kind of rhetoric as perhaps some sort of link to a conspiracy theory, as a dog whistle for something that's going on deeper?
Yeah. The right and the far right have always been anti-intellectual movements to varying degrees, because you know, sometimes you just need to get rid of the people who disagree with you, and they happen to be right. And what can you do but to discredit them?
Yeah.
And also, when you're talking about this nebulous elite of people who are sort of masterminding things behind the scenes, you know, it's not difficult to see where the dog whistle is there and where that could lead.
Yes.
I think there's something as well, which maybe the COVID crisis will make worse, is that until recently, you know, to have a platform, you needed to have money, you needed to know people, etc. Whereas now, you just have a laptop and you can sit in your front room and you can espouse these theories, and everybody on the internet can hear you, get behind you. And obviously now with the COVID crisis, where we're communicating virtually more and more, and is, you know, with the development of the average bandwidth, you know, we can sit here and do a podcast over Skype and it works perfectly well. So I wonder whether, you know, conspiracy theorists will thrive even more in a post-COVID world just by virtue of the fact that they have a much easier tool to communicate to the masses.
The internet has certainly helped the advent of conspiracy theorists. You know, back in the good old days, the Unabomber had to meticulously send in his manifestos to 20 different magazines before it got published. Now he could have just uploaded it to Dropbox. But at the same time, this is something that, you know, sociology has sort of been predicting for a decade. I think this is going to sound very weird, but one of the big predecessors to the current crisis was an event in World of Warcraft, I think called like the Poisoned Blood or something, where there was an in-game pandemic that was wiping out players, and you saw different factions forming in response to it, and different sociological responses that very closely mirror how people respond to an actual pandemic. There were people who isolated themselves. There were people who spread it because they found it entertaining to sneeze on people. You found all sorts.
Did anybody hoard toilet paper?
Not that I know of.
Right.
Where people go on anti-mask protests. I'm genuinely curious about this one. What is it specifically about masks? Do people actually believe this whole thing that it cuts your oxygen and that's really the reason why they're going for it? Is there something more sinister than that going on, do we reckon?
It's a symbol of control, I think, isn't it? I think that's how a lot of people see it, as being told to do something. I think a lot of it is just, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not wearing a bloody mask because you say I should do it. You know, you're not from around here.
But then
Once
again,
you accept one concession, you have to accept more.
But then on the flip side, you know, we do 30 miles an hour in the car when the government says we should most of the time, you know, and we accept the fact that we might get a fine if we don't do it. You know, there are some rules that the government put in place for our own safety, which we're willing as a society by and large to accept. So it's interesting that something like masking isn't.
It is. Perhaps it's because it's something that's come in fairly new, you know, like sort of driving speeds have been there in place for a pretty long time. People are just kind of used to it, adapted to it. But masks is something which has almost been kind of forced upon people, hasn't it, in a way? I mean, it has really, hasn't it? Made an obligation now to wear it indoors. I wonder also if, you know, we spoke about how it's so easy now to share your views online by uploading things onto the internet. Perhaps another thing which makes people maybe distrust, you know, wearing masks, makes people want to believe in conspiracy theories, is that we do seem to be in a general, I don't know how to describe it, age of distrust, in that people seem now more willing than ever to disagree, to call people out, even when there's science and facts backing that up. And it seems like a really bizarre moment in time that we're in, and perhaps the worst time for a pandemic to come, the way I see it.
Yeah. Because, you know, I guess that like Pandora's box has been opened. Like people do have a greater awareness now that not all experts can be trusted, but it takes a lot of research that most people aren't willing to do to work out which experts should be trusted.
I think there's a point. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think there's a point that a lot of people wouldn't know where to start with working out which experts to trust as well. I think it's also the point.
Yeah, people read headlines in a passing way. You know, they're not as consumed with, not all consumed with the news, not all consumed with political discourse. They just see tidbits of information and form their conclusions from that.
A high school graduate isn't taught how to check citations.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend about this the other day, and we were talking about how social media's role in this. And the point he made is the great irony is this time 10 years ago, everyone was terrified that Facebook was going to corrupt the minds of the young. And what actually happened is it corrupted the minds of the elderly.
Yeah.
I read it on Facebook. It must be true.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, a lot of elderly people go on the internet not being so aware of the whole culture of fake news, and they just assume that everything there has gone through fact checkers and is curated in the same way that would be on a newspaper.
Absolutely. I suppose, thankfully, as we move into the future, that will happen less and less as people of all ages become more and more educated.
Yeah, it's that old school belief of trusting what you read in the newspaper, isn't it? Perhaps it's not so true anymore. And I think, particularly with social media, one thing that's really interesting at the moment for me is that I think there is clear evidence that many people do live in bubbles on social media, that people who generally have the same views are recycled and appear on their platforms. And I think when you live in that environment, when you do see someone who disagrees with you, it's a shock, isn't it? Because you're not used to that. You're not used to seeing people disagree with you in a way online. You're used to seeing people with similar opinions, and suddenly someone pops up with a very different view, and you don't know how to handle that in the way that in the past people maybe did more and interacted more, perhaps in communities.
And I also think part of that comes from a lack of face-to-face interaction.
Yes.
I think if the only contact you have with somebody is by arguing with them on Facebook about their opinion on something, you forget that you've probably got 98% in common. If you might have children, you might work a similar way, you might have other similar views and of your life, and if you were able to meet in person and just converse and just have a real conversation, then I think some of them would still exist, but I think a lot of that stuff would be sort of filtered out in a way.
It's moderated as well, isn't it, in public?
And not only that, but we're willing to say things online behind a keyboard that maybe we wouldn't say in real life.
Absolutely. I mean, I know plenty of people I follow on Twitter who I know in real life, and I often think, based on their Twitter conduct, it's like, if I didn't know you in real life and know that I like you, I'd think you were insufferable. And it's none of the people on this call, honestly. But,
yeah, good.
Twitter is a unique type of hellhole.
Yes.
I think we can all agree on that. And I guess another point is that, people on the internet do interact differently when given facts that disagree with them. It's a lot easier to dismiss people who disagree with you on the internet, to say that, they're making it up, they're trolling you. And meanwhile, everyone who agrees with you is based and red-pilled.
And I've also never, ever seen somebody get into an argument with somebody else on the internet and then conclude that with, well, thank you very much, you've changed my mind as a result of this.
Doesn't happen, does it?
No.
Yeah.
And there's no block function in real life.
No, it should, but we have to. I think that's a really good point, that you have to suffer people in real life. I just think when I was a kid, I used to, growing up in Manchester, my parents used to go to the pub and they used to take the kids with them, and you'd go there and you'd play with the other kids, and some of them you bloody hated, but you had to, because you're just there with them, and we all have different views, but you just kind of learn to deal with it. Whereas online, you can just block someone and just ignore that factor, can't you? And it must be a shock.
And that's going to get even worse now that we're all working from home. There's a lot less office interaction. You don't stand around the water cooler these days and talk about politics and, have a real human interaction. I think human interaction is the key to get us to all be friends again.
Yeah, and in the online workspace, there's no such thing as saying something off the record, which I think is another point.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no sort of safe space to say perhaps an unformed opinion, to not have maybe thought something through completely before you say it and regret it later. Indeed, we've all been guilty of that.
Definitely. Can we win back trust in experts? How is that going to happen? Because surely we need experts as a society.
We need more public intellectuals, I think. We need better people who are better at communicating ideas in science, ideas in politics, ideas in economics. Having sort of people to say stuff that's completely impenetrable and just have experts slapped under their name when it appears on the title card when they're being interviewed on the news isn't the solution. We need people obviously doing the research, but we need people who are better at communicating the ideas to the public rather than just, like I say, slapping expert on their name and saying they're an expert, you need to trust them, even if you don't understand it.
I sort of want to see a two-pronged approach in how this is dealt with. One is getting experts to interact more and better with the public. I think that scientific training should include some level of media savviness in how you communicate your results to a wider audience, because so much of academia is incredibly secular and is entirely detached from a lot of working class interests. And that is something that we do need to respond to. At the same time, I think that we also want to raise public literacy in terms of how they're able to interact with information and analyze it critically, both in terms of being able to disentangle the rhetoric that a politician is spewing and to be able to check the sources on something that they see posted on Facebook. I want to see both those things happen. And you know what? That's why I'm here. That's why I left academia. I am here to take all of those big science words and to turn them into weird video game analogies.
Yeah, but you're right. You're right about science. You're you study biology. You're a science communicator. You're the one. Perhaps we should be asking, but how can people with a science background communicate better with the public?
I mean, it's
Talk about
really
video
not a
games
high
when you do
bar.
it.
Most scientists are incredibly bad at communicating.
Yeah.
It's not like the movie stereotype where like the scientist is unable to form a complete sentence, but most of them don't really interact. I mean, most of them either don't really interact with people outside of their field within academia, which means that, their research is isolated to maybe the 5 people who understand it. And most of them don't really interact with the media and the public in a way that sort of engages them with their research. It's a very complex situation. I think if I were to try and speak on it for too long, like I would be misrepresenting my own expertise. I only have a master's degree in communication. There are people who are better versed to speak on it than me. So the best I can say is that it's something we need to work on.
Indeed. Okay. I think that's a pretty good place for us to start winding down. So yeah, I mean that was a really interesting topic. I think there's lots of work to be done. I still think there's a lot of trust that we need to regain in experts. And as Mason said, there's got to be some middle ground. There's got to be effort from the public and from scientists to find that middle point. All right, guys, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Up to you, Mason.
One final point that I did forget to mention in terms of what experts need to do, they need to listen to more people. There's a long tradition in academia of sort of just ignoring lay expertise, ignoring people who know a lot about a field but didn't learn it from academia, and that's something that we need to correct. Medical research needs to include more input from patients, agricultural research needs more input from farmers, so on and so forth. There are so many people who should be able to contribute to science and to expertise that are just sort of cut out because they don't have the right accent, look, or lab coat.
Okay, good stuff. Something I neglected to bring up while we were talking about the US election. I'll bring that in now just as we're winding down. Yeah. So I was going to ask people, list some key swing states, because I've been doing this swing state prediction for Redaction Politics. List some key swing states and ask for some predictions from you guys. How's about that?
That sounds good. Yeah. Richard, do you want to start?
So do you want me to list do you want me to list the state, or do you want me to predict who's going to win it?
I'll name a state and we'll see who thinks is going to win it. So shall we start with Arizona?
Biden. He's gonna do well enough in the Sun Belt, and the changing of the makeup in that part of the US is going to swing it to him. Biden.
How did he vote last time?
Say again.
Arizona's been Republican for a while.
Yeah,
and it would be a flip.
It's also, I think, important to remember that in Arizona, John McCain is adored. He was the senator from Arizona for many years, and obviously Donald Trump has not made friends with him in life or in death. And so I think a percentage of that electorate are going to be voting against Trump in Arizona, and that will mean that Biden will take that state, in my opinion.
I've just got it here. 1996 was the last time the Democrats won Arizona. So that would have been Bill Clinton's re-election.
Mm-hmm.
How about Florida, folks?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me Florida, because I think it's probably it's the one state I really don't know. I mentioned some of the polling that's come out recently that's better for the president. I mean, it would make for if put it this way, if Trump doesn't win Florida, he has no path. If we see on election night that Biden is close, with the postal votes yet to come in, I think that it's a foregone conclusion. So I suppose, to play devil's advocate, I'm going to say Trump for Florida.
How much do you think will affect it? Because obviously at the moment, Florida has a Republican governor and Republican senator. Most recently won the recent Senate seat in Florida.
Yes, and they were both elected on razor-thin margins, which came down to, believe it or not, postal votes. So yeah, indeed. So I think Trump has some structural advantages in the Sunshine State. Not to mention the fact that I think is registered to vote there, or is he registered to vote in New York?
Mar-a-Lago is now his official residence.
Right.
So yes.
Although he has claimed that we should be voting twice, so maybe he'll vote once in New York and once in Florida. But anything is possible. But I'm going to say Trump for Florida.
Any advances on that?
I'm gonna take an optimistic hope that like Biden is able to take it. Florida has a lot of unique circumstances in terms of their medical infrastructure and their levels of veterancy that would obviously benefit a lot more from a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency. It's a question of whether, there's enough public awareness to these issues and to sort of create that response. I think that, COVID is hitting like COVID, like any other health crisis, is going to hit Florida harder than some of the other states. And I hope that might help to swing them around. At the same time, a crisis is also a time that people generally move towards what they perceive as the strong man, which might very well be Trump.
Yeah,
rather than sleepy Uncle Joe.
Yeah, I'm with Mason on this one. I think Biden's going to take it. Yeah, I think Trump's handling of the coronavirus. I don't think it's going to go down well in swing states. I think it's going to hit him really hard. So I think Biden's going to pull ahead.
I think Florida is going to be one of the closest calls of election night. Yeah. Here's one that's been contentious. Because obviously this has been a Republican state for ages, but a lot of people are now saying this could flip. Georgia.
No, not quite. I mean, if we're seeing Biden ahead in the popular vote by 10, 11 points, double digits by the time November rolls around, perhaps Georgia will be in play. But I just don't see Biden's team spending enough time there. They don't need to. It's not a particularly smart electoral strategy to start going after states like Georgia and Texas because they have a path through the Midwest. They they can, if they focus on the states which arguably Hillary Clinton neglected in 2016, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, then he can get 270. I think they don't need a Reagan-esque blowout of electoral votes. And I think if there is an utter landslide, then sure, Georgia's in play. But I'm saying Trump.
Fair enough. I think I'd agree. Even though I did kind of try to play devil's advocate with it last time and say maybe it will flip, a la when Obama flipped Indiana in 2008 against all expectations. Like I say, it would take a landslide. And back last time I did these predictions, I was thinking a landslide was in play, but I think it's getting closer now. And I think it's more looking like a 50-50 knife edge as to the overall result itself.
Yeah, and if you look at Stacey Abrams' election in 2018.
Brian Kemp won it.
Yeah. I just think it'll be a bridge too far for the Democrats.
Yeah. Okay, and then obviously the next one I'll bring up is a group of states, that being those Rust Belt states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Biden for me. All four of them.
All four of them. And I think that's where he's going to get the tipping point. That's where 270 electoral votes are going to happen. You look at, I know Biden's from Delaware, but he has a lot of that kind of Midwestern honesty. I think he will resonate well on a personal level in a lot of these states. In Pennsylvania, the fact that he took the train to work every day, and home every night to make sure he can tuck his kids into bed. His military background of his kids, coupled with the fact that employment in those parts of the US is being hit hardest. I think his message is going to resonate with the Midwest.
Yeah, I think my prediction, to be honest, will be I think Trump might just hold Ohio, but I agree that the other three will go back to Biden.
I agree. Yes, but that will be offset, I think, by the fact that Biden will win in Arizona. He may win in North Carolina as well. And if you add the electoral votes of Arizona and North Carolina, they're more. That's 20 electoral votes, and you've only got 18 in Ohio. So, yeah.
And if Trump lost and won Ohio, he would be the first. That would be the first time since 1960. I think I'm right in saying that Ohio went with a losing candidate.
It's a real bellwether. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's Ottawa County, Ohio, that has literally, even beyond then, it's just that county in Ohio that always tends to go with the winning candidate.
But then I wonder how long that's going to last, just because Ohio is moving further right than the average in the US, while states like Arizona, Texas are moving left. So we may see a bit of a realignment. But for me, Ohio is Trump now.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been wasn't New Mexico was another one that was a bellwether for quite a while, but is now fairly solid blue.
Yeah, and Virginia was pretty solid red up until 2008, and now it's we're not even talking about it. We're not even talking about it. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
I do think we need to add sort of the caveat to all of these that, like, we haven't really accounted for the potential of voter suppression being enforced in some of these states, because I think that is, a very real issue. It's something that we do need to worry about. The outcome is obviously going to be broadly determined by those postal ballots that we talked about earlier, and it's very possible that the different states will handle it in different ways.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I think there are some states who have Democrats in control on a state level, and and them coupled with the Biden campaign and the DNC, they're going to do everything that they can possibly do to make sure that as many votes are cast and counted in the way that they should. But I absolutely don't disagree with you. It could have an effect, especially if it's very close.
And last but not least, Texas.
Bridge too far.
Trump.
Yeah. So you've only got to look at 2018. Beto O'Rourke against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was not a popular senator everywhere else. Beto was very popular, in this country, in California. But I think it'll be closer. I think there'll be less than 5 points in it ultimately, and maybe in 4 years, maybe in 8 years, as the makeup of the state becomes less and less white. But I think it's a bridge too far, and I think the Biden campaign would be silly to waste resources for those electoral votes when they don't need them.
Yeah, I agree. I think, to be honest, if anything, Georgia is more likely than Texas.
Yeah.
But, and there we have it with a few swing state predictions for you. We'll be keeping you up to date with all of those nearer the big day.
Yeah, make sure to keep following James's predictions. They're great. He's keeping us well informed.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much for listening or watching, depending if you're on YouTube or on our podcast. Last time Mason did a dab, and to be honest, I think it could have been better.
It's difficult on a webcam. But I did prepare something special today. I did mention that, it is easier to trust an expert wearing a lab coat, and the opposite also being true. It is a lot harder to take me seriously if I sign this off in a tinfoil hat.
No, you've got to say something profound now, Mason.
Okay. I very nearly made the joke that I made off microphone previously that would probably get us sued for libel. So I'm gonna.
I think it
stop
might. So you had better stop yourself there.
Yeah. I'll say it after we cut the recording. Don't worry.
Yeah.
For Richard's benefit.
We'll let all of our comment below with what you think Mason was about to say. In fact, don't if it's libelous. Don't comment.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening or watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, guys. Bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.